What is up, fellow monkeys? Manny here, welcome back to part 2 of this mission 8C+ in hindsight. In part 1 we talked about the characteristics of the enemy in order to find out how to train the body in the best way possible to attack it, and what I actually did in terms of training quality and quantity during this pretty much 1 month of intense projecting, the principle of prioritization to eventually defeat it. However, doing all this training without paying attention to something called conditioning at this point is pointless in my opinion. I would rather skip all the training and do just the conditioning part, to be honest, if I would have to choose between the two. What gives conditioning such importance is the fact that performance gains come much quicker, are more dramatic and more reliable, and in most cases even connected with less suffering compared to finger strength training, for example, or power endurance burns and so on, especially if these systems operate close to one's limit already. What I mean by conditioning is any performance favoring, most often temporary, behavior of the athlete apart from training. What comes to mind instantly when we talk about climbing is body weight, obviously. Being lighter will have a huge impact on your limit performance. I've talked numerous times about this fact in the past, especially on steep terrain where lots of weight has to be carried by fingertips and little weight reaches the toe tips, which is where most high-end routes take place these days. I made a whole video series about conditioning tips and tricks, which is in my opinion almost complete, in case you're interested. For the sake of this video, I will now only talk about those strategies I utilized to send this 8C+. After around 3 weeks of the projecting month, I had the feeling that I got back into the route quite solidly. After a few sessions in spring, I hadn't touched it all summer, because the Crag is much too hot during that season. I had the sequences down again and could quite frequently climb to the second crux, where I most often dropped out quite pathetically, like a sack of pumped potatoes essentially. Additionally, I noticed that the days got colder and the air got drier. Autumn was around the corner. Apart from frequent weather forecast checks to find ideal days for outdoor sessions, I also always had this thermometer thing with me at the Crag, which tells more or less exact local temperature and humidity, and I noticed from both sources that peak weather conditions were cruising in. These circumstances signaled me that I should start conditioning my body towards sending shape essentially. Maybe a few words on ideal weather conditions and such before that though. Most often you will hear climbers talk about ideal conditions in either autumn or winter. When I started outdoor climbing, I couldn't really understand this. I always liked warm days for climbing, and I didn't really have problems with climbing in the sun and stuff like that. I felt it was simply more pleasant not to be cold while belaying or resting, for example. I didn't really pay attention to temperature or humidity for a long time. Cold or warm didn't matter from a performance standpoint. I just enjoyed warm more because it meant less suffering. However, I'm pretty certain that already back then my performance was subjugated to the effects of weather conditions, but because I didn't pay attention to it, I simply didn't notice it. If I'd have to pinpoint one event that changed that, I would go with projecting my first 8C back in 2016. On these sessions I could really feel how just low temperatures and this cold body tightening feeling from climbing in around 13-12 degrees Celsius and something like that helps with performance. And then later on I noticed it even more when I started outdoor bouldering, which tolerates even lower temperatures, seeing as you neither have long climbing times which would cool your fingers down from cold rock, nor longer belaying times where you have to rest, which would make you cold again as well. That's also when I started taking my thermometer thing with me to track environmental conditions on outdoor sessions, and I think that taught me a lot actually. Nowadays I view it as perfect conditions if I have goosebumps all over right before I start an attempt. I think the main reason why cold temperatures make peak climbing performance possible is less or even non-existent sweat in and on fingertips, and therefore harder, tougher, more crystally skin and underlying collagen tissue, which especially in combination with chalk bites into natural rock better, granting more friction, allowing smaller energy expenditure through holding and less chalk loss while climbing, also resulting in less demand for chalking up while climbing. In part 1 I mentioned that I didn't chalk up one single time during the 8C+ ascent. Without a doubt this wouldn't have been possible if conditions hadn't been on point that day. Apart from fingertips, it's also the shoe rubber, which gets a bit harder and allows for greater friction if the right model is used, of course. Here again the reference to the Scarpa Drago, which I reviewed recently and which I also tried on the 8C Plus, which performs quite badly in warm but quite well in cold conditions due to the soft rubber. For actual attempts, I still went for the 510 team, as for me personally, it's just a better shoe. Something which is overlooked often as well is quote-unquote general body tightness. It feels as if muscles are just under greater tension if it's cold. The mind is very clear, maybe a natural response along the like of, hey, let's get the hell out of here, you know. This is unpleasant and it costs a heckload of calories, which kind of questions the general healthfulness of climbing in the cold, but yeah, for performance it just works, you can't deny that. Another thing often overlooked is humidity aside from temperature. On my measuring thing there's a hygrometer as well, which tells the humidity in percent, and here I'd say that from my experience in about 80% of the cases less humidity means better conditions. The drier the air, the better. And this makes sense seeing as we prefer dry fingertips over sweaty ones and dry rock over waterfalls, you know. However, the correlation is less significant than with temperature. It seems that humidity is a bit less important. Additionally, it seems to be the case that on some rock, greater humidity is actually helpful for some reason. I'm thinking about certain kinds of very slopey granite, for example, or very slopey sandstone, you know. But that's up for debate and dependent on personal preference and experience, I guess. Taking all that into account, it's quite safe to say that ideal outdoor conditions for climbing will probably occur in autumn and early winter, after a hot, dry summer when temperatures go down but moisture doesn't creep up yet. This usually makes autumn superior to spring, where it's cold as well, but all the snow and stuff melts up and it's moisture in general, you know. Of course, this also depends on the region. I mean, there's definitely exceptions from these very general laws. However, essentially that's why I started my projecting phase when autumn cruised in at the beginning of October. So much for outdoor conditions. Before diving into the topic, I mentioned I got back into the route quite well after 3 weeks of projecting, which made me feel like I was ready to start with body conditioning. So time to finally talk about that for a bit. After those 3 weeks, I started to consequently eat just 1 meal a day. The diet geeks amongst you very likely know what I'm talking about already. 1 meal a day, or OMAD, is the practice of consuming all your daily food calories during one relatively short eating window. And this definitely leaves some room for interpretation, you know, as to when to eat and how short the eating window should be. The way I did it was I utilized a 1 to 2 hour eating window, always eating after training, but ideally not too close to bedtime. So usually at around 5 to 6 p.m. I ate as much as I wanted, from all the food groups I wanted, including carbs, sorry keto people, including animal products, sorry vegan people. When the next day was a day on the project or intense training, I went relatively low fat, relatively high carb, high starch to be more exact, plus some red meat, so essentially steak and potatoes, as I feel this gives me the best power output for the next day. When the next day was a rest day though, I went a bit higher fat. During project days, I had a bit of honey milk in the bag to refuel some direct energy when necessary for attempts, breaking the OMAD routine a bit. On all other days though, I was pretty strict. From past experiments, I already know that if I combine training and outdoor days with an OMAD eating regimen like this, I will constantly lose a bit of weight, no matter what I eat during that short eating window. Not as quickly as with fasting or even dry fasting obviously, but therefore more sustainably. And I didn't have that super one ideal day in sight anyway, you know, as it was with the Mission 8B, for example, where I had to lose the weight very quickly. I decided to keep that ace in the pocket for when things get serious, and in the end, it turned out I didn't need it at all. OMAD was the more ideal strategy for this project because I could keep training and recovering and always get a bit lighter in the background, so to say, while waiting for ideal days to attack the project when circumstances would allow it. This is also why I couldn't really do a live Mission 8C Plus video series like with Mission 8B, because success, although quite certain, was time-wise quite unpredictable, and I can't do just daily videos all the time waiting for it to happen. I think that would get quite boring after some time, which is why I'm reconstructing the process in this hindsight format now. I hope that's interesting too. Anyway, after around 10 days on OMAD, I sent the route on a day where everything came together essentially, with very good environmental conditions, 10 degrees Celsius, sun, bit of wind, and very dry air. Unfortunately, I don't know how much I weighed on that day because I was away from my scale, but I guess I was around 3 kilograms lighter than usual than when I started the OMAD regimen, so around 63 kilograms or something. Still a good bit away from super high performance weight, by the way. I think I could go down to around 60 if I really wanted to push it. I think on mission 8B I was on 61 point something on sending day, which is very light for me. But yeah, minus 3 kilograms body weight made a very noticeable positive difference on the project already. Sometimes I have the impression that body weight is even neglected by climbers, you know. I often hear sayings along the like of, meh, 3 kilograms, that's not even 5% of your total weight. I don't think that makes a lot of a difference. But in that case, I can tell you that you haven't climbed on your true limit yet. On limit routes, 3 kilograms less is a whole new world in terms of how the project feels. Think about it this way, it's a little less effort on every single move, but a couple of moves back to back and it adds up to quite a significant difference in terms of pumpedness and so on. And also depends on the characteristics of the route, obviously. As a rule of thumb, I'd guess if you have huge shakeouts every 5 meters, where you can rest back to zero anyway, body weight becomes less of a factor compared to consistently demanding power endurance boulder pieces with lots of moves back to back, where any difference in single move effort adds up quite quickly. Honestly, I think even differences as little as 300 grams are noticeable. I can definitely feel a difference from simply dropping a sweater, for example, which checks in at around that weight. Carrying as little as 3-4 quick draws makes a noticeable difference as well, to give some examples. Anyway, OMAD was not the only conditioning strategy I applied to achieve this body weight. On the day before sending day, I utilized another method I discovered way back when I sent my first HC and which I hadn't used for a while actually, the leg lightening evening run. When I more or less finished digesting my OMAD for the day, which actually goes quicker on OMAD because digesting efficiency is increased due to increased insulin sensitivity and so on, I went for a 40-minute 4-foot run in the evening at around 10 p.m. Since I never do this these days, not even during the more intense projecting phase, maybe I should have done it earlier, this had a dramatic effect on my legs. It emptied them almost completely from glycogen, making them significantly lighter, and it took only 40 minutes of easy pace running to do that. And since I didn't eat anything afterwards, they didn't really get a chance to recover that weight overnight. So the next day I was waking up with pretty light but pretty sore legs. The walk up to the crag was kind of painful, I have to admit, but it paid off. So much for conditioning on this thing. The only thing missing now is a properly orchestrated attack to not waste all this preparation on stupidly paced attempts, wrong resting times, overconsumption of fuel, etc. So let's give this an examination as well. We usually arrived at the crag at around 11 AM. Most of the time my partners would then start with their warm-up and after a little rest do their first attempt on the route. Mostly I was there with Thorsten, who deserves a special thanks for his excellent and patient belaying and who also belayed the ascent and who got his hands onto the very nice 8A which shares the exit with my project. So we would let him start, mobilize, warm up his fingers, do his warm-up checkout, go on the project, rest a bit and then let him do his first attempt. All in all, this took around 45 minutes. The reason he went warming up and attempting after a short rest right after, without having me interfere by doing my own warm-up and stuff directly after his, is that both of our projects were very bouldery and short, which means that attempts, regardless whether successful or not, would not take a lot of time. Contrarily to the warm-up, which takes significantly longer. Additionally, we attacked on days with good, meaning cold conditions. Had I done my warm-up directly after his, or vice versa, we would have been cold again when it was time for an actual attempt, since our warm-up programs take so long. I usually let my partners start when I'm projecting hardcore, because that way I can create even more distance to my last meal to really get into that fasted, low insulin, high energy output performance state. My warm-up looked very similar and took at least 45 minutes as well. Once the attempt of my partner was finished, and he was ready for a longer rest, I started with my mobilizing routine and stretching of legs and hips, which is crucial on outdoor climbing sessions, especially on rope. I've talked about that numerous times in the past. Then grabbed a few holds on the rock to wake up my fingers, then most often went into the project straight away to get the single moves into my body and then do some links. Maybe you're thinking now, is that smart, going still relatively cold into an 8A boulder start? I personally am a big fan of warming up in the project, even if it's tough, the reason being that no skin and energy is wasted on something that doesn't work towards the main goal, which is sending. Had I instead warmed up on something easier, I'd have had to warm up on the project afterwards anyway, in the end spending more skin and energy than by just warming up on the thing right away, you know. It's a very effective strategy if the project is skin demanding and daytime is limited, both of which were the case here to some degree. If you do it, you have to be careful though, and take it slowly, obviously. What I did first was getting the rope into the first 2 pre-clips, and then again I just simply grabbed the holds, you know, pulled myself onto the wall, just hold some body positions for a couple of seconds, and then did the first few single moves, then connected a few moves and slowly but surely get the body into performance mode. Once I had bouldered through both cruxes, not even necessarily successfully, I came down, rested for 5 to 10 minutes and then made my first attempt, on which I usually would fall on crux number 1, which makes sense seeing as these moves were warmed up on first, around half an hour ago. But since a 20-second attempt like this takes almost no energy but rewarms the fingers quite well for these max strength moves, you know, the starting boulder essentially, I would then rest another maximum 5 minutes and do another attempt straight away, on which I usually would already get to crux number 2. An attempt like this already costs around 1 minute of hardcore climbing and gets you quite a bit pumped, and therefore demands significantly more energy, calling for a proper rest afterwards, during which I would belay 2 back-to-back attempts of the partner, who would ride a similar strategy as their climb would be very bouldery as well. And that's basically how an attack was executed. After the first 2 rounds I would usually feel my energy stores get a bit depleted, and that's when I started taking a few sips of honey milk, always before a longer rest belaying my partner. Another very important and very interesting detail is that I always took a piss right before tying into the rope. You know, water is very heavy and you don't want to carry that weight up a limit project. And a lot of water is actually created during such a session. It's cold, you're active, the body burns a heck load of calories under these conditions. A lot of oxidative water is created in your body waiting to be excreted, so do it the favor. And then on the 8th of November, during a session with really good conditions, it happened, you know. First attempt I dropped on the dyno. In the attempt right after, I already fell after the second crux on the hardest connection move into the 8A finish, and then after a longer rest I could power through. I hope you enjoyed this little hindsight mission 8C+. Again, my goal was to demonstrate what actually goes into such an ascent in terms of training, conditioning strategy and attacking. Let me know down below if I succeeded, as well as if you have any more questions, and yeah, drop a like if you've got something from the episode. Obviously that's very helpful, as you know, and until then, I'll see you soon in the next one, guys. Bye!